Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that some of America's most iconic cars, from the Dodge Challenger Hellcat to the Ford GT, aren't actually built in America? And what if I told you that the country that does build them, a nation with immense natural resources and a world class manufacturing workforce, doesn't have a single car brand of its own? There is a profound and baffling contradiction at the heart of the Canadian economy, a paradox that becomes more pronounced the closer you look. Every year, a river of steel, aluminum, and plastic flows through advanced assembly plants in southern Ontario, emerging as over 1.3 million brand new vehicles. This is a staggering volume of production. These are not obscure models, they are some of the most iconic and best selling vehicles in the world. The thunderous Dodge Challenger Hellcat Demon, an emblem of American muscle, is born in Canada. The technologically revolutionary Ford GT, a supercar that serves as America's standard bearer on the global racing stage, is meticulously assembled by Canadian hands. Alongside these titans of performance roll the practical, everyday champions of the North American road, the ubiquitous Toyota RAV4, the reliable Honda Civic, and the rugged Chevrolet Silverado. These vehicles emerge from some of the most advanced, efficient, and highest quality auto plants on the planet. And yet, not a single one of them wears a Canadian badge. Every last car, truck, and SUV that rolls off these sophisticated lines belongs to someone else. The profits flow to boardrooms in Detroit, Tokyo, and Stuttgart. The designs are finalized in studios in Michigan, Aichi, and Baden Württemberg. It is a nation of world class automotive builders who own nothing they build. Canada, a manufacturing giant, is a ghost in its own machine. This reality is made all the stranger by the fact that Canada is not merely a convenient location for assembly. It is, by any measure, a nation that should have its own car industry. On paper, it possesses every conceivable ingredient for automotive sovereignty. The land itself is a treasure chest of the raw materials that most nations can only dream of importing. There is nickel from Sudbury, a critical component for batteries and alloys. There is aluminum from Quebec, smelted using immense hydroelectric power. There is copper from British Columbia and cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements buried within the vast Canadian shield. These are the very building blocks of the global electric vehicle revolution. The human capital is just as impressive. Canada boasts world class engineering universities, a deeply skilled and experienced manufacturing workforce, and a reliable, often green energy grid to power it all. It has everything. So why doesn't it have a single car brand to call its own? What happened to the nation that, for a fleeting moment, ranked as the second largest automaker on earth? To understand why all the cars built in Canada still belong to someone else, we must look back to a time when a Canadian car was not a fantasy, but a fact. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the beginning. The story really starts in the early 20th century, specifically in the years following the First World War. Around 1918, Canada's auto industry was not just surviving, it was booming. This period, often called the brass era for the distinctive metal trim on vehicles, saw a flourishing of domestic innovation and production. This wasn't an industry of one or two small workshops, it was a legitimate nationwide enterprise. Over a dozen Canadian companies were actively building and selling their own cars. Names like McLaughlin, Brooks Steam Motors, Grey Dort, Russell, and Tudhope were known to Canadian consumers. The McLaughlin Motor Car Company, based in Oshawa, Ontario, was a particular powerhouse, producing thousands of cars per year, a significant volume for the time. These were not just vehicles for the local market. Canadian automakers were exporters. By 1923, a year of peak production, Canada had achieved the unthinkable. It was the second largest automaker in the entire world, surpassed only by the industrial behemoth to the south, the United States. Think about that. Canada, with a population of roughly 9 million people at the time, was outproducing established industrial nations like Germany, France, and Great Britain. This golden age was made possible by a perfect alignment of three strategic advantages. The first was geography. Canada's proximity to Detroit, the epicenter of the automotive universe, was an incredible boon. It allowed for the easy transfer of American technology, parts, and engineering expertise. Many Canadian companies, including McLaughlin, got their start by licensing American designs or partnering with US firms before developing their own unique vehicles. The second advantage was logistics. The Great Lakes were not a border so much as a superhighway for heavy industry. A company could cheaply ship iron ore from Minnesota, build cars in Ontario, and then move the finished vehicles through the canals and seaways to markets across Canada and crucially overseas. The third and most powerful advantage was political, the imperial preference system. As a member of the British Empire, Canada held a golden ticket. British nations, including the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa, imposed high protectionist tariffs on American made cars. However, Canadian built cars were given preferential treatment, facing low or even zero tariffs. This effectively made Canada the automotive backdoor to the entire British Empire, an enormous and lucrative export market that was all but closed to its American rivals. At the same time, Canada protected its own burgeoning industry, tariffs on imported US. Cars forced American giants like Ford and General Motors to make a choice: either pay the tariff and be uncompetitive or build factories in Canada. They all chose to build, creating a unique ecosystem where Canadian independence and American branch plants existed side by side. For a brief, shining moment, everything aligned. But this golden age was built on a fragile foundation. The very geography that had been an advantage soon revealed its dark side, exposing a fundamental problem that would eventually kill the entire independent industry to market size. Building cars is one of the most capital intensive businesses in the world. It requires enormous upfront investment in factories, tooling, and supply chains, often costing hundreds of millions of dollars before a single vehicle is sold. To make that investment worthwhile, you need scale. The more cars you produce, the cheaper each individual car becomes. This is the ironclad law of economies of scale. If you build 10,000 cars a year, each might cost $30,000 to make. If you build 500,000, that cost can drop to $15,000 per car. This is where Canada's population gap became a fatal weakness. In the 1920s, Canada's 9 million people were competing with an American market of 115 million US. Giants were producing for a domestic market more than 10 times larger. Ford's factories in Detroit alone were building more cars than all of Canada's automakers combined. This allowed them to achieve a scale and a low per unit cost that Canadian companies could never hope to match. Canada's internal geography added another layer of complexity. The population wasn't concentrated in one dense region. It was a thin ribbon of civilization stretched thousands of miles from the Maritimes to British Columbia, fragmented by the vast rocky Canadian shield, the prairies, and the Rocky Mountains. The entire Canadian market was roughly the size of one large American state, but with immense logistical costs. Shipping parts and finished vehicles across the country was costly and slow. American factories, in contrast, could serve dense nearby markets at a fraction of the cost. For years, one thing had saved the Canadian independence from this brutal reality: the imperial preference system. The guaranteed protected access to the British Empire was the lifeline that kept the factories running profitably. And then, in October of 1929, the stock market crashed and the world economy fell with it. The Great Depression was a perfect storm that hit Canada from every direction at once. Global trade froze as countries, including those in the British Empire, threw up massive protectionist tariffs to save their own workers, slamming the door on Canadian exports. At the exact same time, the domestic market collapsed. Unemployment soared past 25%. Only a wealthy few could even dream of affording a new car. For Canada's independent automakers, it was an extinction level event. Their exports vanished, their home demand dried up, and their high fixed costs remained. One by one, the pioneers disappeared. By 1935, almost every independent Canadian automaker was gone. The only survivors were the branch plants of the American giants, who had the deep pockets and vast home markets to survive the downturn, and the few Canadian companies that had sold themselves to those giants, like McLaughlin, which had been acquired by General Motors back in 1918 to become GM Canada. The dream of a Canadian car built by Canadians for the world was over. Now, you might be wondering what came next. After the Second World War, Canada's auto sector rebuilt itself, but it was a fundamentally different industry. The independent brands were gone, replaced entirely by the big three American automakers, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, operating Canadian factories. The old challenges remained: a small domestic market, high costs, and a total dependence on the whims of American corporate headquarters. Tariffs protected Canadian jobs, but they also kept Canadian car prices artificially high and made the factories inefficient, as they often had to produce multiple models on slow, costly assembly lines. By the early 1960s, this lopsided relationship had created a massive, unsustainable automotive trade deficit with the United States, which had ballooned to between 300 million and $785 million, depending on the year. Canada was buying far more cars and parts from the US than it was selling, a significant drain on the national economy. Something had to be done. In 1964, Canadian and US officials sat down to find a solution. The result was a landmark, continent altering treaty, the Automotive Products Trade Agreement of 1965, known simply as the Auto Pact. The agreement was, on its surface, simple. It eliminated all tariffs on new cars and parts traded between the two countries, but it came with critical safeguards for Canada. In exchange for this free trade, the big three automakers had to guarantee a certain level of production in Canada. Specifically, they had to maintain a production to sales ratio of at least 1 to 1, meaning that for every one car they sold in Canada, they had to build at least one car in Canada. This new reality gave birth to a curious and unique chapter in automotive history: the Canadian spec car. To meet their production quotas and appeal to the distinct Canadian market, which often favored smaller, cheaper vehicles, US manufacturers created a series of unique rebadged models sold only in Canada. General Motors sold the Acadian Canso, a Pontiac branded hybrid based on the Chevy 2 platform. Dodge trucks were rebadged and sold as Fargo trucks. Ford famously rebadged its F Series trucks as Mercury trucks and created the Frontenac, a slightly modified Ford Falcon adorned with maple leaves. The Auto Pact was, in many ways, a resounding success. The crippling trade deficit vanished. Canadian factories, now able to specialize in producing just one or two models for the entire North American market, became models of efficiency. Jobs skyrocketed, with over 100,000 people employed in the sector. But this success came at a steep, unstated price: the complete and total loss of automotive sovereignty. The Auto Pact had saved the Canadian auto industry, but it had killed forever the chance of a Canadian auto brand. From that point on, Canada's role was permanently cemented. It was no longer a nation that designed its own cars, it was a nation that assembled cars for the Americans. The industry became fully integrated, a single continental system where parts and vehicles flowed frictionlessly north and south. Canadian factories were now just pieces, albeit very important pieces, in a much larger American puzzle. The fate of an entire town in Ontario now rested on decisions made in a boardroom in Detroit. This was the great trade off. Canada had chosen secure jobs over independence. The Auto Pact defined the Canada US automotive relationship for decades, but the rest of the world was not standing still. In the 1970s and 1980s, a new wave of competition arrived from across the Pacific. Japanese automakers, led by Honda and Toyota, were building cars that were cheaper, more reliable, and more fuel efficient than anything coming out of Detroit. They began to eat into the North American market at an alarming rate. These Japanese companies, however, faced the same problem the Americans had faced in Canada decades earlier: tariffs. Both the US and Canada had import restrictions to protect their domestic big three. The Japanese automakers needed a way in, and Canada devised a clever strategy to become their middleman. While the Auto Pact was an exclusive deal with the US Big Three, Canada was free to cut other deals. It offered Japanese companies like Honda and Toyota something called duty remission incentives. This policy essentially stated that if a Japanese company built a factory in Canada, it could import its parts, like engines and transmissions, from Japan duty free, as long as it exported the finished cars. The primary destination for those exported cars, the United States. Canada effectively became a Trojan horse for Japanese automakers to bypass US import quotas. They began to eat into the North American market at an alarming rate. The US grew increasingly unhappy with Canada's middleman status. By the late 1980s, the push for a new all encompassing deal was underway. In 1989, the Canada US Free Trade Agreement came into effect. This agreement, which was later incorporated into the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, effectively superseded the Auto Pact. It eliminated the last vestiges of protectionism, including the all important 1-to-1 production to sales ratio. It created a truly frictionless continental market for all cars and parts, regardless of the manufacturer's origin. The Auto Pact was officially canceled in 2001, but by then it was already irrelevant. The new open market favored the companies with the most capital, the largest scale, and the most advanced technology, namely the US and Japanese giants. The Canadian automotive market had not just been integrated, it had been completely and totally absorbed into a single North American system. This brings us to the modern era and the core question. Let's say a Canadian entrepreneur filled with patriotic ambition wanted to launch a new mass market Canadian car brand today. Could it be done? Technically, the answer is yes. The talent, the raw materials, and the engineering know how are all there. But in practice, the economic and logistical barriers are so immense as to be practically insurmountable. First is the barrier that started it all: market size. Canada's population of 40 million people is simply too small to support a domestic mass market automaker at the scale needed to compete globally. The entire Canadian market buys about 1.7 million new vehicles annually. A new company, to achieve the economies of scale needed to make its cars affordable, would need to sell millions of cars per year. This means it would have to export to survive from day one. But exporting means going head to head with Toyota, Volkswagen, and General Motors, established brands with decades of reputation, multi-billion-dollar marketing budgets, and vast global dealer and service networks. It's a fight a startup cannot win. Second is the barrier of the supply chain. A modern car contains roughly 30,000 individual parts. No automaker, not even the giants, makes all those parts themselves. They rely on a massive, intricate global supply chain. The North American auto supply chain, in particular, is one of the most tightly integrated in the world, woven inextricably across the US, Canada, and Mexico. A single component tells the story. General Motors engineers in Warren, Michigan might design a new transmission. That design is sent to a smelter in Saguenay, Quebec, which uses massive hydropower to turn raw bauxite into aluminum ingots. Those ingots are shipped by rail to Street Catharines, Ontario, where they are cast and machined into the transmission's high tech components. Those components are then shipped nearly 2,000 miles south to Ramos Arizpe, Mexico, where they are installed into a Chevrolet Equinox. That finished SUV is then shipped back north, crossing the same borders again to be sold at a dealership in Illinois. One component, three countries. A new Canadian brand would face an impossible choice: either build its own supply chain from scratch, which is impossibly expensive, or integrate into the existing US dominated supply chain, thus losing its independence from the very beginning. Third are the barriers of geography and cost. Canada's climate makes manufacturing more expensive. The simple act of heating a massive factory through an Ontario winter costs more than operating an equivalent factory in Tennessee or Mexico. Construction can be delayed by weather, and equipment must be winterized. Furthermore, if you build cars in Canada, you are geographically distant from the largest population centers in the US. This adds significant transportation costs, making your vehicle more expensive than one built in Alabama or South Carolina. Finally, there is currency risk. The Canadian dollar fluctuates against the US dollar. This creates crippling uncertainty for a startup. If the Canadian dollar is strong, your exports suddenly become more expensive and uncompetitive. If it's weak, the parts you must import become more expensive, eating your profits. Established giants can hedge this risk across global operations. A startup cannot. The brutal economics of the industry mean that any new Canadian brand would almost certainly fail before the first car even reached a customer. The dream of a mass market Canada car may be dead, but the spirit of Canadian innovation is not. While it's impossible to compete with Toyota, it is possible to thrive in the margins. The exception to Canada's automotive rule is in high end, specialized, and commercial vehicles where scale is not the primary driver of success. In this niche, Canada is a world leader. The province of Quebec, for instance, is home to Prevost, a company that builds some of the most impressive, luxurious, and technologically advanced tour buses and motorhomes in the world. Their H3 negative 45 VIP, a 45-foot long land yacht, is the vehicle of choice for touring rock stars and corporations. This is high value, bespoke manufacturing. Then there is the Campania Corporation, creator of the outlandish T Rex. This three wheeled motorcycle engine powered machine is a pure performance track toy, appealing to a wealthy clientele that values raw experience over practicality. In the realm of security, Conquest Vehicles builds the Night 15, an insane, bulletproof, and uber luxurious armored SUV built on a Ford F550 platform. It is the literal Hulk to the Ford Excursion's Bruce Banner, a vehicle for heads of state and billionaires. And for pure speed, the supercar company Felino, founded by a Canadian race champion, builds the CB7R, a 700 horsepower V8 powered track car that looks like something from a science fiction film. These companies prove that the capability is here. The ambition is too. Recently, Project Arrow, an all electric concept car, was built using 97% Canadian made components, a proof of concept that the talent and technology exists to build a modern vehicle from the ground up. But it remains a prototype, not a production line, a spark of potential without the economic scale to sustain it. This desire has a history of tragic failures. There was the Bricklin SV, one in the 1970s, a bold gull winged sports car built in New Brunswick that collapsed after just 3,000 units. There was the Zen, zero emission, no noise, motor company in the early 2000s, one of the first electric car startups which vanished after a few years. The pattern is always the same: ambitious vision, early excitement, and a head on collision with the brutal wall of small market economics. And now, this entire century old dynamic is being supercharged by the greatest shift in the automotive world since the invention of the assembly line itself: the transition to electric vehicles. If the 20th century was defined by the engine, the 21st will be defined by the battery. On the surface, this looks like Canada's golden opportunity, the moment to finally break the cycle and build something of its own. After all, those raw materials mentioned at the start, the vast deposits of lithium, nickel, and cobalt buried in the Canadian Shield, are no longer just geological footnotes. They are the most strategically critical and sought after commodities on the planet. This natural wealth, paired with Canada's massive grids of clean, renewable hydroelectric power in provinces like Quebec and Ontario, allows the country to offer something almost no other nation can: a complete mine to motor, low carbon EV supply chain. For a world desperate to decarbonize, green batteries built with green energy are the ultimate prize. This potential has unleashed a modern day gold rush, a frenzy of investment, creating a new battery belt stretching from Windsor to Quebec City. The scale is staggering. Volkswagen, the German giant, is building a state of the art gigafactory in Street, Thomas, Ontario, an investment so large at over $7 billion for the first phase alone, that it has been called the single biggest industrial project in Canadian history. Just down the highway in Windsor, Stellantis, the multinational parent of Chrysler, is partnering with Korea's LG Energy Solution to build its own multi-billion-dollar battery plant. Honda, a pillar of Canadian manufacturing for decades, is spending nearly $15 billion to retool its entire Alliston, Ontario campus, not just to build EVs, but to process cathode active materials and build batteries right on site. But look closer, and you'll see this is not the story of Canada's independence, it is the story of its interdependence, written in larger, more expensive letters. Not one of these gigafactories is Canadian. They are German, Korean, Japanese, and multinational. And the primary driver for this wave of investment isn't just Canada's pristine resources, it's American politics. The United States' massive continent shifting Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, is the real engine here. The IRA offers huge tax credits to American consumers who buy new EVs, but only if those vehicles and, critically, their battery components and minerals are sourced from North America or a designated free trade partner. In an instant, this policy made Canada the most important strategic partner in the world for any global automaker wanting to access the lucrative US market. Suddenly, Canada is no longer just a convenient place to build cars. It is an essential source for IRA compliant batteries and minerals. And so the cycle repeats, but with stakes higher than ever before. The Canadian federal and provincial governments are providing tens of billions of dollars in public subsidies to attract and secure these foreign plants, matching American incentives to ensure the factories land north of the border. It is a perfect modern echo of the Auto Pact, a deliberate, calculated trade off. Canada is leveraging its public treasure and its natural resources to secure its place in the new continental supply chain, ensuring that Canadian workers will have high tech jobs for a generation. But the fundamental relationship remains unchanged. Canada is not becoming an owner. It is simply transitioning from being the master craftsman of the internal combustion engine to being the master craftsman of the electric battery. So when you look at the whole picture, the story of why Canada can't build its own cars is not a story of failure. It is not about a lack of capability, skill, or ambition. Canadian engineers design critical components for vehicles sold across the globe. Canadian factories, consistently ranked among the best in the world for quality, build some of the highest value vehicles in North America. Canadian auto workers are among the most skilled and productive on earth. This is a story about geography, economics, and a deliberate historic trade off. Canada sacrificed its automotive independence for economic security. It made a deal first with the Auto Pact, then with NAFTA to exchange sovereignty for jobs. The result is a robust, world class manufacturing sector that employs hundreds of thousands of people but is owned entirely by foreign interests. The profits flow outward. The high level strategic decisions are made in foreign boardrooms. Canada, in essence, chose to become the world's greatest automotive craftsman rather than an owner. Today, the race has changed from engines to batteries. New multi billion-dollar battery factories are rising in Ontario and Quebec, a bet that Canada can become a key player in the electric vehicle supply chain. But this new race is not fought on equal ground. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, a massive domestic subsidy dwarfs anything Canada can offer. China dominates the entire EV supply chain, from rare earth mining to finished battery cells. It seems Canada's role in the new automotive world will be the same as its role in the old: a highly skilled, resource rich, and indispensable partner, but a partner nonetheless. Geography locked Canada into a north south relationship that, while stripping away independence, made perfect economic sense. The vast, sparsely populated country with a small market simply could not support a domestic industry at the scale needed to compete. Its fate was and is to be integrated with the behemoth to the south. Canada's role will likely always be to build with unparalleled quality other people's dreams.